Good evening. I'm Paul here at the Garland County Library, and tonight we're hosting a special guest speaker. Her name is Janis Percefull, and she is a historian, a retired instructor at National Park College, and the recipient of a Gender Studies Award from UALR. And she's here this evening to talk about the life and legacy of Susan B. Anthony, who of course played a pivotal role in the women's suffrage movement, giving women the right to vote, which is very timely since August is National Women's Suffrage Month. So Mrs. Percefull is here and she's gonna take over, so enjoy the presentation. And if you have any questions, be sure to ask them in the Facebook live feed comment section and she'll get to as many as possible at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And I'd also like to thank the entire staff here at the library for allowing me to present this program in the auditorium. I want to make it feel as much like a live performance as we can. Having taught and researched and written about history, 19th century history, you cannot help but run into Susan B. Anthony along the way. And it wasn't until last year that I had decided to really, because this was the 2020 was going to be the time, the 200th anniversary of her birth, as well as the 100th anniversary of the women's right to vote. So I decided to write something, and the more I researched, the more I realized this needed to be a lengthier presentation. And it's also I was planning it to be for a live audience. So what I've done is tonight I'm going to do an abbreviated version of a larger program that I hope to do later on when COVID-19 crisis subsides. Susan B. Anthony, the woman behind the legend. What was she like? What was her personality like? It's important that we know what people like Susan B. Anthony were like, because we look to successful leaders of the past to emulate. Miss Anthony was a leader in the 19th century women's rights movement, and that was an umbrella organization to a lot of social reform movements of that era, including the anti-slavery movement. Miss Anthony was one of the ladies who steadfastly held on to the handle of that umbrella, no matter how tumultuous the times became. So in our own tumultuous times, it behooves us to know what people like Susan B. Anthony were like. Throughout this presentation, I will be referencing an 1896 interview that Miss Anthony did with someone named Nellie Bly. Nellie was 36, Miss Anthony was 76 at the time. Both of these women were world renowned. Miss Bly for being an investigative reporter, and Susan B. Anthony for being a world renowned humanitarian. Now, at the time of this speech, the publisher knew this was going to be the time of the interview, the publisher knew this was going to be a big story. So he gave her 7 columns in the paper. Now, Miss Anthony had her own reasons for wanting to be interviewed at this time. It was something she was fired up about. And Nellie really didn't get that until later on in the interview. Years before Miss Anthony, when she first got started in her public life, her good friend Henry Stanton was reading his an account in the newspaper, an account of one of Susan's speeches, and he was reading it to his wife Elizabeth Cady Stanton, another friend of Susan's, and he started laughing and he said, "Fire Susan up and she'll fire up the world." Well, that's what she was about to do in this 1896 interview. Now, at the time of this interview, there was a great deal of excitement in American society, and in fact in societies all around the world. And it had to do with the general application of a lot of science and technology that had developed over the last 2 or 3 decades. But it was also a time of great despair and disparity. We were going through a depression during the 1890s, and there was disparity between rich and poor, native born and immigrants, men and women, black and white. On the other hand, it was also a very exciting time for everyone who had been fighting, both men and women who had been fighting for women to gain the right to vote. The people during that time, especially the people who had been fighting for women to gain the right to vote, they had this feeling that women were going to gain the right to vote, that it was just like right around the corner. And they had no way of knowing that it would be, and they probably could not have imagined, that it would be another 25 years, a quarter of a century, before women gained the right to vote. Also, this interview took place right in the middle of the bicycle craze of the 1890s. It's hard for us today to imagine how important the bicycle was, but it predated the automobile. And at the time, it was expensive to own a horse and buggy, and to even rent one. So a bicycle by the mid-1890s had become safe, it had become relatively inexpensive, and it was becoming more and more inexpensive. People all over the world were just going absolutely nuts for the bicycle. It was an independent means of travel. Well, by 1895, you started having a big pushback against women riding bicycles. And at first it was, well, they were being poked fun of, and they were being called Betty's Bloomers. Now, calling them Betty's Bloomers harked back to when Miss Anthony was young and late 40s, early 50s. And she and her friends, one of them called Amelia, they were wearing, it was a type of outfit. It was a dress with ballooned out pants. And they were trying to address the issue of women's dress. There were a lot of things that women wore back then that were actually harming them. It was not good for their health. Well, at the same time, they were advocating for different other reforms. And so it was easy to lampoon them and do characters of them in their outfits, and it harmed their serious work against the slavery movement to abolish slavery. Well, they all stopped wearing it except Amanda. And I said Amanda, it's Amelia. Well, her last name was Bloomer, hence we have Betty's Bloomers. So making fun of them didn't work, so then they thought about shaming them. So they said, it's unladylike. It's unladylike to ride a bicycle. Well, that didn't work either, so then the religious community got in on it. And really just, it's unchristian. It's immoral. It's leading down the path to prostitution. Now, yes, there were preachers that would get up and say things, and they would write things, and some of the things they wrote were just horrible. Disgusting, actually. But the people who were the most organized, I mean, they were organizing in communities all over the place. They were called the Women's Rescue League. The Women's Rescue League. They were trying to rescue women from a life of degradation by keeping them from riding the bicycle. Fortunately, the medical community was all for women riding bicycles, and that was because in the 1890s, you had a health movement sweeping the United States, and it was called naturopathy. And the 3 elements of naturopathy were fresh air, sunshine, and exercise. My goodness, that was ready-made for the bicycle. Now, Susan B. Anthony, she understood all of this that was going on, and she was quite aware of the fact that the medical community was an ally for women riding bicycles. So in the middle of all this excitement and all of this social tension, you had a great deal of impatience. Women in 1896 were impatient. They had had enough. Women had been crawling on their bellies for centuries. And now, thanks to their mothers and their grandmothers, now they had gotten on their knees, they had stood up on their feet, and now they were ready to take that first step toward full emancipation. It has now been 100 years since women took that first step toward full emancipation. I do not know what that second step will look like, but I do know that if women do not take that second step, they will never learn how to walk and to run and to hop and to skip and to jump. About a third of the way through this 1896 interview, Miss Anthony changed the topic. She actually asked Nellie a question. She said, what did she say? She said, "Now you want to know when I first heard about women's suffrage?" Now, it's hard to believe that Susan B. Anthony wasn't born knowing about women's suffrage, about the importance of voting, but she didn't. She had to learn, as we all do, the importance of it. And the things you can do when you register to vote. That's where a lot gets missed, is that Miss Anthony, she started out simply trying to get signatures on a petition and worked very hard at it, but to no avail, because these signatures didn't count. So she learned a very valuable lesson about suffrage for women. Well, Nellie got her back on track and asked her a few more questions after she let Miss Anthony talk for a while about the whole suffrage movement. And then she was answering some questions. And then she did something very unusual. And you can kind of picture Nellie writing. She was writing down what Miss Anthony was saying. And you can imagine Miss Anthony waiting for the next question. Well, instead, she just reached over and she put her hand on Nellie's arm. And she said, "Let me tell you what I think about bicycling." Now, she didn't say, "Would I?" or "May I?" She said, "Let me tell you what I think about bicycling. I think the bicycle has emancipated women more than anything else in the world. And when I see a woman riding by on a bicycle, I want to stand up and cheer." She just set fire. In a few words, she accelerated the cause of women's rights, and she forever intertwined and locked into place the idea of the bicycle and women's suffrage. She was a brilliant tactician. With a few words at the right time in the right way, she could fire up the world. She was born 200 years ago to a Methodist mother and a Quaker father. Those who knew her in childhood said she had a phenomenal memory and an insatiable appetite for learning. From letters and diaries and journals, all kinds of correspondence, we get a picture of a woman who was very much both her mother's and her father's daughter. Both her parents were fun-loving, open-minded, and people of conscience. And these were characteristics that Susan displayed throughout her life. They say Susan's mother had a good voice, and she loved to sing and dance and wear fashionable clothes. And this was all very un-Quaker-like behaviors, and they were behaviors that Susan appreciated. They tell us her mother was also kind of daring. They tell this story about her mother that a few days before she was to get married. Now you got to remember, this was like about 1817 when the Anthonys married. She decided she was going to go out dancing, and she did not invite her intended. And she stayed out until 4 o'clock in the morning. Now, I don't want to leave you with a bad impression of Mrs. Anthony. When she got married, she toned down her dress and activities. She got along fine. The Quakers liked her. She liked the Quakers. But she never joined the society. They say of Susan's father that he had a lot of energy and was a very determined man. And these were two traits that Susan showed in abundance throughout her life. When she was 6 years, by the time she was 6 years old, her father was a very prosperous mill owner. And it was a small community, and he was probably the biggest employer around. If you were a Quaker in a small community and you were prosperous, likely there was not a school. And so the prosperous Quaker would usually create a school, because they wanted their children, both the girls and the boys, to be educated. And this was not always the case. Sometimes there were places where girls couldn't go to school. But the Quakers wanted their daughters to be educated, and they wanted them to participate in discussions in class, not just to be there. A lot of the preachers, the Quaker preachers, were actually women. And so that was one of the things that impacted her about education. And she fought awful hard once she started her public life to actually fight for women being able to be educated. There was an incident that happened when she was 12 years old. This was 1832. There was a woman that worked, one of the women who worked in the mill. She had to be gone for 2 weeks. And so Susan, who was 12, and her sister Hannah, who was 10, they both volunteered to work there in the mill. Well, the mother was like not sure she wanted the girls to do that, but the father was just all for it. He was so proud that his daughters were showing some independence. So they talked it over and they came up with a plan. And that's a wonderful thing about what I discovered about the Anthony family. When the children were old enough to be responsible, the parents would bring them into the conversations when there were decisions to be made. So what he did, he said, we're going to draw straws if y'all agree to this. We draw straws. Whoever wins, the one that wins will go to work, and the other will, you'll get paid. It was $3 a week, and you will split your money with your sister. And so they both agreed to it. So they drew straws. Susan won, so she went to work, and both girls were paid. This was kind of like a common sense solution to a labor issue. In 1837, the United States experienced a panic, and then by 38, we went into a depression. And this depression lasted for a few years. In the summer of 1838, the Anthonys had lost everything, and everything they owned went for sale. It was auctioned off. Now, both the Anthony children and both parents had grown up. That's 2 generations had grown up in prosperous, stable environments, and all of a sudden they had lost everything. Susan was 18 at the time. What we saw, or what we see in this family, is that what they did, they made a circle and they pulled in. The Mrs. Anthony's brother helped to buy back some of the personal items, like their extra undergarments. I mean, when you literally, back then, when you lost everything but the shirt on your back, it literally was everything but the shirt on your back. They moved 2 miles in 1839. They moved to Center Falls, and Susan and her older sister left and they went to teach, and they were sending their money home to help keep the family going. Now, the father took down what he owed the girls, and later when he got on his feet, he paid them back. But for a while, they had to, help support the family. Susan was in New Rochelle that year, and during that year she got sick, and we don't know what from, some kind of illness, but we do know the kind of treatment she was given. They did some bloodletting, and back then that was the era of heroic medicines. If a little bit is good, more is better. They would do a cut at the bend of your arm and go down about an inch or so. They also gave her pills, calomel pills, which were given for everything. They were a mercury compound. So during the night, her incision opened up and she nearly bled to death. So the family came and got her. We see her in the next year. She had regained her health. She had a teaching job there in the town they had moved to. So she was at home. And we see from her diaries and from family letters that she had turned into a typical 20-year-old girl. She was socializing. The family had struggled for 5 years, and finally Mr. Anthony made the decision that they were going to move. And so Mrs. Anthony's brother had monies that Mrs. Anthony had inherited, but because she couldn't buy property, there were a lot of rules about what women could and could not do. So he was in control of her money. Thankfully, she had a brother that cared about her, and he paid for the down payment for a 32-acre farm outside of Rochester, New York. And so they moved there. And then from 1846 to 49, Miss Anthony started teaching at a place called Canajoharie. While she was there, she became, it was a time of becoming really independent. She started socializing, dressing up, and going to a lot of different places. She wrote in her diary, there were a lot of men around at the time, and she wrote in her diary that there were 3 widowers who were courting her all at the same time. And she talked about one that was a lawyer with several children. And she had already indicated earlier in her diary that she didn't think that was a good idea for a young girl to marry an older man with a lot of children, even though he was prosperous. She then described this young man. She said, very handsome, sleek as a ribbon, and the most splendid black hair I ever looked at. Now, he was probably a very young, very penniless man, because we were still in a depression and young men didn't have much opportunities. Now, while Miss Anthony was busy trying to decide which dress to wear and which bow to favor with her attention, the great social movements of the day were percolating to the point of boiling over. So here she was, laughing and dancing and singing and going to the theater and long moonlit drives. And that was okay. It was okay to be a typical 20-year-old. During this period of her life, she developed a sense of style and fashion, learned to handle a variety of people and situations, acquired skills and abilities that would later help her to become a great leader. And no matter what she went through in her long public career, she never lost her quick wit, easy laughter, sense of adventure, good humor, or her sense of style. In fact, these attributes, skills, and abilities became her best armor. She was also getting a little daring at this time. In the June of 48, she went to her first, it was her first circus. And then later she went to a military ball. It was about the time she went to the military ball that she wrote in her diary, something distasteful happened. And she said, "My fancy for attending dances is fully saturated. I certainly shall not attend another unless I can have a total abstinence man to accompany me, and not one whose highest delight is to make a fool of himself." Now, it was at this time that she joined the local Daughters of Temperance, and began to speak out quite forcefully about young men who get drunk and what they do to young women, and they get away with it. Then in the early part of 1849, something very, very tragic happened in her life. She had been living with her cousin Margaret and her family for about 2 years. Margaret, she was having her fourth child, and it was a hard birth, and she suffered for several weeks before she passed away. Susan was by her side most of the time. Susan felt as if her cousin's husband had treated her like a servant, and now that she needed her, that he neglected her. After she passed away, Susan left and went home. Now, we don't know the details of everything that happened to her in that period of her life, but we do know that something happened that brought her to the breaking point. In her diary, she wrote something very uncharacteristic of her. She said, "I seem to shrink from my daily tasks. Energy and stimulus are wanting. I have no courage. A great weariness has come over me. I have no courage." This is an astounding revelation from a 29-year-old woman who became the very definition of courage, who became a legend before she was 50 because of her courage. Susan stayed at the farm for 2 years. Eventually, with the love and care of her family, she regained her footing. She bounced back. Then she became restless. Then she got fired up. One day she wrote in her diary that all the men had left. They had all gone out to the gold fields of California. The last sentence in that entry, she put a huge exclamation mark. She said, "Oh, if I were but a man so that I could go." Equal economic opportunity. She and her sister both had worked for years to help support the family, making $2 to $2.50 a week, while the men teachers, who were not as smart as she was, wasn't as good at teachers as she was, they made $10 a week. That was not lost on her, that she couldn't go out to the gold fields of California. At this point in her life, she made a life-altering decision about the direction of her life. She wrote a question to herself in her diary, and she spent the rest of her life answering that question. She said, "What can I do for humanity?" At that point, she turned her back on teaching. She stepped into the public arena, and she walked into history. By the time of this 1896 interview, she had been walking into history for about 40 years, and she had long been a legend. But through it all, she was still a typical woman. The last question that Nellie Bly asked her was a very delicate question. And by the answer she gave, we can tell that even at 76, Miss Anthony was still her mother's daughter. Nellie kind of tiptoed around the question. And by the way, it would be a delicate question today. She danced around the question, and then she said, "Miss Anthony, have you ever been in love?" Miss Anthony laughed and said, "In love? Bless you, Nellie. I've been in love 1,000 times." Nellie gasped and said, "Really?" And that's all she could say. The romantic in me likes to think that they had an extended conversation and it didn't get into print. The historian in me, who has studied both of these women's life, I can tell you they did have an extended conversation. One of the things that they did print, it was Miss Anthony was talking about her past, and she said, if I had married 50 years ago, she said, can you imagine, said, I would, all these years, I would have been some rich man's doll or some poor man's servant. And then you can almost see her cock her head, and she said, can you imagine that? Well, I like to think they had a very fun time talking for an extended period of time on that. At the end of the article, Miss Anthony, Nellie, described Miss Anthony as lovable, good-natured, with a sunny disposition. That is the picture I want you to take tonight with you of Miss Anthony. I appreciate this. It's been a delight. I've had fun, and we're going to open this up for any questions anybody might have. So, Paul, take it away.
Yeah, we do have a couple questions. Let's see.
I'll take a drink of water here. Just
can you go into detail about the story of how Susan B. Anthony ended up on the coin?
No, I can't. I have absolutely not a clue about how she ended up on the coin. Well, I mean, usually things like that happen like that. It's somebody has the juice to get it done.
Let's see. Other than Susan B. Anthony, who were the pivotal figures in the women's suffrage getting passed?
Somebody has asked who were the pivotal players in the women's rights movement?
Other than Susan. Well,
Susan B. Anthony was certainly the one we know the most about, but Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and you know, my mind's going blank here, but there were so many women, but to give you some feel for why Susan B. Anthony is so much out front, because she didn't have children and she wasn't married, she was able to be out there more than the other women were. And at some point, and I think it was in the winter of '58, when she was getting kind of upset, because it was like she was out there and she was kind of upset that all the other women in the movement seemed to all be having babies. And it was like, can y'all just stop for a while and give me some help? I mean, this is me talking, but I mean, it's just, you got that feel about that. But there are so many women, and I'm just going blank here. But anyway.
Last question we have is, was Susan involved in protesting for equality? I assume they mean other than.
Well, that was, man, that was her life. Yes. That's what she was about. Yeah.
Do you feel her Quaker upbringing made her more aware of the lack of women's equality?
That's a good question. It definitely imprinted her. It probably did. Yeah, it probably did. The world in which she grew up in was, in other words, like going to school with the boys, being part of the discussions within her home, and even in the community with other Quakers. It was expected that they join in and be a part, and they were treated and like you know, equals. And then she gets out in the world and sees that how women are treated, you know, second-class citizens, and so many things appalled her because she wasn't. So yeah. Simple answer. Yes.
Oh, yeah.
That's it. Well, I don't feel I answered some of those very well, but anyway.
Well, is there any final story or maybe a detail you left out that you want to leave everyone with?
Boy, there's a lot of stories about her. I don't even know which one to pick now. Hang on a second here. We got some time? We just kind of flipping through here. Well, let me just see here. Well, one thing, this goes back to when she was a child. There was so much in her childhood that imprinted her, and her parents were such good role models. That was one thing that struck me. Like, they had a problem. Okay, when she was 6 years old, that's the 1820s, 1826. The father had his employees sign a pledge to say they could not drink wine. I mean, excuse me, they could not drink whiskey, but they could drink wine and hard cider. That was kind of a common sense way to do it. It was evidently whiskey was what was causing some problems. He also said that if they got drunk on the job, they came to work, they were fired automatically. And that made sense because you had machinery. And but she learned a lot of things from her parents that was just a good way to deal with situations like labor. By the way, when he started his school, if anybody that worked for him wanted to be educated, he would make sure that happened as well. Here's a little tidbit about Miss Anthony. Now picture this. They had a lot of people coming to their home, and they would be discussing the different aspects of what they were agitating for, different reform. And back then you had like a front parlor, and that's the public place where people would meet and talk. Well, sometimes they would, almost every time they would serve refreshments, but sometimes people would come for dinner. And so the two older sisters, Susan and her older sister, they would help the mother cook, whether it was refreshments or a dinner. Well, Susan liked her reputation of being a good cook. So she was kind of torn between being out there in the parlor because she liked discussing things, and being out there, being in the kitchen. And oftentimes she chose the kitchen because she didn't want to lose her reputation. I thought that was kind of a little interesting thing here. It was something else I was going to. By the way, there's in letters when she was 20 and getting over that illness that she had, said that Susan's Tiptop dinners. So yeah, I know what it was. I was going to say, her father was always getting in. How much time do we have? 5 minutes. Okay. Her father was always getting in trouble with the elders of his church there, and it was usually because he was a man of conscience. And the young people in the community came and wanted to have a dance school, and they knew that he had the room, and he said, "Oh no, I couldn't do that. That was like really beyond beyonds." And but then his wife was talking to him, and she said, "Honey," said, all you've got is that tavern down the road, and all they serve is whiskey, and that is really a bad place for them. So that's all it took. So he started a dance school. Now the kids were not allowed to dance, but they were allowed to be there and socialize. and Mrs. Anthony and her two oldest daughters, they served refreshments. So it was really, I'm sure, a fun experience for everybody. But it was a bridge too far for Mr. Anthony, and there were repercussions for him. But there again, that's just another example of his being a man of conscience. They were a fascinating family. Every one of them, and every child of the Anthonys in their own right, they were reformers, and they all helped each other. And Susan, because of various reasons, she's the one that ended up, that really hung on to that umbrella. Okay. This has been fun, delight. I appreciate it. Thank you.